million Tainos in the Caribbean, 33 million Incas in South America, 30 million Aztecs in Mexico, and 7 million Apache, Comanche, and Navajo in the West, for a grand total of 73 million people. Until great extermination.
The estimates were created based on the few available documents. They know these documents do not give exact figures. We have accounts with estimated numbers of people in an army, in a battle, or the number of people baptized by the friars in different places. But of course they are not exact, and everyone had their own interests. If it was convenient for a group of Spanish soldiers to exaggerate the number of enemies they faced, then they did. They did so without holding back. Perhaps it was the way of speaking of that time, or maybe they did it with the intention of attracting more investment to the area. We do not know why, but that's how it was. The tendency to present median mortality figures of 30 or 50% decreased noticeably around the second half of the 20th century when US academics came into action. But this led to introducing an ideological bias in the estimates. And this is what happened with the series of estimates made by the University of Berkeley in California between the 1950s and 1970s. In 1950, well before these estimates from 1972 and 1966 were made, an American academic highlighted the fact that all these estimates were created based on assumptions upon assumptions. He warned that there was enormous risk since each estimate pulled figures from the previous one as a given, and this literally happened. The biggest problem is that each estimate is based on the previous one, assuming that it was shown accurately or that an honest calculation was made. There was never a serious discussion within the Academy of Science or Geography about the number of dishonest estimates that had been made, or the lack of concrete evidence for the numbers that were put on the table. I decided to investigate all of this because I read a supposedly climatological study which stated that in America, in 1491, there were 65 million inhabitants, and that as a result of the arrival of the Europeans, 56 million inhabitants died in the first century, which is 90%. I said, let's see, the drop of 90% of the population anywhere causes incredible social disruption. In other words, these populations are not restored. The fall of 40 to 60% in Europe caused the fall of the feudal regime. It caused a historic change. Well then, why do we not have record of such a decline, of such magnitude among the native population? And to add, assuming the worst, how is it possible that they exploited the native people, using them to build cities, engineering works, etc.? How if they were dying in droves? Because it turns out that during the 16th century, more than 700 cities were built in what was Spanish America. Well then, how is it possible to build 700 cities if 90% of the native people are dying? How are they going to prove it? Could they prove it materially, with archaeological remains, human remains, even by doing DNA studies that there were 25 million people in central Mexico? They never did. It is also fashionable to talk about large cities in the Amazon. Here we are doing what we always do, greatly exaggerating the numbers. But there is also a downside. According to studies, these cities, no matter how populous they were abandoned in the 14th century, before the arrival of Columbus. But this is not taken into account. We will see this in many studies that include these estimates for their purposes. Now I will talk about the study that asserts the 56 million deaths. The study is done by a group of geographers from University College London and is a dishonest, poorly conducted study with zero relevance in the world of climatological studies. The vast majority of references it has are not from climatologists or anyone from the world of science. They are from people in the social sciences. They say that the arrival of Europeans to America caused such a catastrophe. To support this, they have only one piece of physical evidence, which is a pair of ice cores from glaciers in Antarctica that show a small decrease in CO2 around 1610. The figure for the year 1610 is not irrelevant, because English colonization started around 1620, and the most shocking thing of all is that this study was published in the English press 4 days before it was officially published, and all the authors, who were completely unknown, were interviewed 4 days before the study was published. What surprised me the most is that ABC itself distributed it without providing a single argument that would question anything that was said in this study. This study is merely selecting a few population estimates, mostly artists that I have mentioned, doing some mathematical calculations. They never clarify how they were done to get the figure that suits them. Running that study is laughable. It makes no sense and is not even taken seriously within the world of climatology, but it has been widely circulated in the media because it adds a scientific nuance to the black legend. As I stated, looking at the dates mentioned in this study, conveniently the majority of the deaths occurred before the arrival of the English and the French. This is not a coincidence, and this is what I mean. Those who talk about the Black Legend, who are combating it effectively, who have an enthusiastic contribution in this sense, should be more aware that the Black Legend is now being given a scientific nuance because of these highly inflated population figures. I was both intrigued and shocked that figures which were so blatantly absurd had not sparked more debate within the academic world. But from my perspective, the most absurd thing is that these figures are still being utilized today as evidence, but is that we also have several myths lodged in our minds. The first is that of a healthy America, meaning the mental image that comes to the minds of many people in America is that the native people were healthy, well-nourished, in their prime, and did not suffer from diseases. This, of course, is heavily disputed. They suffered from their own diseases, some of which were contagious. Thanks to many memes, cartoons, and comics, I think we all have a romanticized image of the indigenous hero as represented in sculptures, which doesn't match reality. The second myth is about a plentiful America where indigenous people had all kinds of food. It's fascinating how some authors go above and beyond in describing the abundance of prey, listing animal species which are mostly small in size, not bred for consumption. Instead, they had to be hunted. Then there's the topic of cannibalism. These same authors uphold it as a part of indigenous life. They say on one hand there was an abundance of prey and they were well fed, and on the other they resort to cannibalism due to lack of animal protein. Contradictions are a constant when talking about America. The third myth speaks of a peaceful America, an America in harmony, which for unknown reasons made indigenous peoples an exception to human norm. Apparently they all lived in harmony with each other. Well, we only need to remember that upon the arrival of the Spanish, the Tainos asked for help because they feared the Caribs' attacks, who raided villages and practiced cannibalism on them. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, who ruled over several native groups and their enemies, are more well known. This reign includes floral wars and frequent human sacrifices which reached horrifying scales. I'm fascinated by Bora. He introduced the idea that Mesoamerica was overpopulated in his studies with Cook. This same Bora also claimed that the Aztecs sacrificed 250,000 people a year. The average indigenous person can recite the figures from Bora and Cook's study like a parrot. They say that 25 million people lived there, and remember that in very little time there were only 1 million or so left. Again, these are the figures from Bora and Cook's studies, which I consider pure fantasy. It's not just me. There are authors who wrote books exposing the tricks that Bora and Cook used to inflate the pre-Columbian populations and then inflate the deaths after the arrival of the Spanish. The average native radical activist believes these false figures, that there were 25 million people and only 1 million or so remained. But when presented with the figure of 250,000 sacrifices that Bora provided, they say, no, this isn't possible. In other words, there's a significant bias in what we choose to believe. We have to insist again and again that we need to learn to question these population studies. Moving north, the tribes of North America, present-day United States and Canada, had numerous conflicts among themselves, and it wasn't unusual for some to ally with English colonists to attack their adversaries. Moving towards the Andes, the Inca Empire expanded during the 15th century. It was a relatively recent empire, as was the Aztec-Mexica Empire. And around 1530, a civil war occurred between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar to claim the Inca crown. This civil war was interrupted by the arrival of Pizarro and his Spanish allies, changing the course of history, but it was indeed still a very bloody war. They even suggest that birds could have been vectors of cold viruses, as it has recently been suggested that birds could transmit bird flu. You need to have more defenses to engage with these studies. They are suggesting totally impossible things, and we're swallowing it, and we have to argue so much to explain that they are not proven in any way, and on top of that, they demand that we prove it's not true, something they have failed to prove themselves. Everything would be much simpler if we knew how to question what we're told. But we are not even doing this with Bartolomé de las Casas's figures yet. In many articles in newspapers and on the internet, Bartolomé de las Casas's figures are still being quoted. These figures should now be seen for what they are. Pure speculation, exaggerations of a mind prone to invention, regardless of whether it's for better or worse. His aim was to attract attention. And to illustrate how little Las Casas cared about this exactness, I'll mention that in his most famous work, he starts by affirming that 12 million people died because of the Spanish. In the middle of the work, he doesn't even remember what he said, and he raises it to 15 million people. But at the end of the conclusions, he suggests that it was actually 24 million people.
meaning in his famous work he simultaneously asserts that due to the Spanish, 12, 15, and 24 million people perished. Why? Because he wasn't concerned with being accurate, but rather attracting attention.
That it's not at all proven that 90 to 95% of the native population died from the Spanish presence. In fact, it's impossible.